Thank you very much, members of the committee, and thank you for giving me time today to speak to you. I hope that my testimony will have shed some light on the situation. And I'm sorry if it was too emotional. Thank you.
Madam Trépanier, we're now going to move over to Mr. Akhavan for 10 minutes, sir.
Monsieur le Président et honorables membres.
Mr. Chairman, honorable members of the committee, I'd like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my perspective with you on the events that led to the crisis within rights and democracy.
Because of my belief that justice should prevail over political expedience. It was very much to my advantage to remain silent. But faced with the abuse of power in an organization committed to human rights, I could not remain silent in good conscience. I was honored to be appointed by this government as a director on February 29, 2008. I was aware then that in December 2002, the Inspector General had issued recommendations to improve financial oversight and management staff relations. The board immediately began to implement these under Janice Stein, who was then the chair, and then under the presidency of Jean-Paul Hubert. Upon the appointment of Rémy Beauregard as president by the government on June 26, 2008, he successfully continued this process. In August 2008, the 5-year review of rights and democracy by Foreign Affairs concluded that the overall results of this review are positive and have confirmed the effectiveness and relevance of the organization's activities in the field. The Auditor General's June 9, 2009 report was also positive. In short, contrary to what the current chair, Oral Brown, asserted before this committee on April 1st, upon his appointment on March 11th, rights and democracy was not dysfunctional. But in the months that followed, the organization disintegrated as a minority of directors engaged in a hostile takeover. The conflict began within the board after Mr. Brown's first meeting as chair on March 26. The board majority was highly satisfied with Mr. Beauregard's performance, but the chair instructed the secretary not to record this in the minutes. Mr. Brown and Gauthier were concerned about small grants to 3 organizations. As a compromise, the president agreed not to provide further funds. Mr. Brown also insisted that he should have a veto over all future grants. Again, we accepted a review procedure as a compromise. Mr. Brown and Gauthier opposed participation in the UN Durban Review Conference. But Mr. Beauregard had already decided to boycott this event with the unanimous support of the board. Instead of praising the president, these directors submitted a secret evaluation to the Privy Council with baseless accusations, half-truths and distortions that disregarded or minimized his successful leadership. It attempted to portray him as anti-Israel on the very issues that had already been resolved to everybody's satisfaction. The chair's harsh note to the report called it constructive criticism. To us, it looked more like character assassination. Earlier demands by the president and board majority to see the evaluation report were rebuffed, and a law firm was retained at the cost of $17,298 to justify the decision. When it was disclosed through the Privacy Act at the June 18th board meeting, the majority considered repudiating it. Again, as a compromise, we gave them an opportunity to amend it, and they agreed. Our trust was betrayed. There was no intention to honor this agreement. Instead, there was a plan to change the board to the liking of the chair and his allies. On September 4th, Ms. Donica Potti, the government representative on the board, suddenly resigned just 7 months into her 3-year term. She had earlier submitted a positive report on Mr. Beauregard on behalf of the government. With her removal, the chair was poised to get a 7-6 majority with 2 new appointments. On October 19th, Mr. Brown and his allies suddenly postponed a board meeting on just 2 days' notice. The board majority was excluded from this decision, which cost $15,000 in cancellation fees. Still short of a majority, They wanted to avoid consideration of the report, which they had failed to amend 4 months later. They also wanted to block reappointment of Guido Riveros Frank, a respected Bolivian democracy expert that Ministers Fletcher and Kent had regularly consulted. On November 8th, I wrote to Mr. Gauthier asking him whether there was an intention to gain, and I quote, a decisive majority of board members that will once and for all silence the dissenting board members and probably also set the stage for removal of the president and his senior staff. That is what I wrote to Mr. Gauthier on November 8th. Once the 2 new appointments were made on November 13th, Mr. Brown immediately called a meeting of the board for January 7th. Having secured a 1-vote majority, the Performance Committee met with Mr. Beauregard on January 6th at an acrimonious meeting in which they dishonored their promise to correct the report. At the board meeting, it became clear that this 1-vote majority intended to completely exclude the other half, having already decided everything in advance. For directors like Sima Samar, who had traveled all the way from Kabul to participate, this was greatly insulting. Some days earlier, in email exchanges relating to our concerns, Mr. Navarro Jenny, one of the directors, had referred to us as, and I quote, third worldists, comparing us to Robert Mugabe, and contrasted us to, and I quote again, Her Majesty's British North American subjects, end of quotes. As we had predicted, this had become a hostile one-party board, and the stage was set to remove Mr. Beauregard and management. When Mr. Riveros Frank was kicked off the board, it was the last straw. Dr. Samar and I decided to walk out in protest. It was a moment of utter shame. The resignation of a human rights champion from Afghanistan from a Canadian human rights agency. That day, Mr. Beauregard was visibly distressed, knowing he would probably have to resign with a stain on his reputation. Little did we know that this great friend and colleague would leave us for good shortly after. After his tragic passing, before his funeral could even be held, we were shocked that internal documents were leaked to Ezra Levant and Gerald Steinberg to continue smearing his reputation. The opinion editorials by the 7 board members against him were simply shameful. The call by 45 courageous staff for their resignation was an expression of respect for an admired leader and of loyalty to the integrity of the institution. In order to exact revenge, the same board has now hired expensive lawyers and private investigators to persecute the staff. This has already cost an estimated $500,000 of taxpayers' money. And in the new era of accountability that the board proclaims, they have amended a bylaw to retroactively justify awarding these lucrative contracts without tender, which only adds to other financial irregularities concerning the board's budget. We can only be thankful for this committee's oversight. In closing, I would note that the honorable members of this committee may have competing political agendas, but I'm confident that they all agree that unethical conduct cannot go without consequences. The smearing of Mr. Beauregard's reputation is a manifest abuse of power and probably also a violation of the Occupational Health and Safety Act. The Canadian Centre for Occupational Health and Safety recognizes that making false accusations against an employee is a prime example of workplace bullying and that such psychological harassment can have serious health consequences. Let us consider the allegation in Mr. Gauthier's famous memorandum that, quote, while attending a conference in Cairo in the fall of 2008, Mr. Beauregard met with representatives of Hamas and Hezbollah. Mr. Gauthier states further that the legality of these meetings is obviously questionable. He clarified during the June board meeting that he was referring to the Criminal Code of Canada. In particular, Section 83.18 provides that contributing directly or indirectly to the activity of a terrorist group is punishable by 10 years imprisonment. In his response to the board, Mr. Beauregard had said that this accusation is patently false and I consider it an attack on my reputation. So without a shred of evidence, a distinguished bureaucrat with a spotless record